At some point in human history, somebody looked at a patch of dirt and thought, "That's mine," which is a strange idea when you think about it. Dirt does not come with name tags. Trees do not recognize deeds. Deer are notoriously bad at respecting property lines. And yet today, entire legal systems, fortunes, wars, mortgages, and awkward arguments with neighbors depend on the belief that one human can claim exclusive rights over a piece of the world. So when did that begin? For most of our species' existence, humans survived by moving, sharing, trading favors, and depending on other people. Then gradually something changed. Food could be stored. Land could be improved. Houses could last for generations. Labor could accumulate. And suddenly, walking away from your stuff became expensive. Private property was not invented in one dramatic prehistoric meeting. It emerged when mine became useful enough that everyone else had to start taking it seriously. Before humans could invent private property, they first needed something worth keeping in one place. That sounds obvious, but for most of prehistory, a lot of valuable things had the annoying habit of moving. Animals wandered. Fruit ripened and disappeared. Rivers shifted. Wild plants came into season and then basically said, "Good luck. See you next year." For mobile hunter-gatherers, survival often depended less on owning a specific resource and more on maintaining access to many different resources through movement, cooperation, kinship, and exchange. If one hunting party had an unusually good day, sharing some of that meat could make sense because next week, they might be the unlucky ones. In economic terms, food sharing helped smooth out risk. In normal human terms, today you have mammoth. Tomorrow I have mammoth. Everybody wins. That does not mean prehistoric foragers had no concept of possession. A person could have tools, ornaments, clothing, weapons, or objects with personal meaning. Groups could also recognize territories, hunting areas, water sources, or customary rights of access. But there is an important difference between saying, "This spear is mine," and saying, "Everything growing on that hillside belongs exclusively to my household." One is easy to defend. The other requires a lot more confidence, and possibly several angry relatives. Private property becomes especially useful when three conditions begin to overlap. Something is valuable, something is predictable, and something can actually be defended. A stone knife fits that description reasonably well. A migrating herd does not, and this is where human behavior starts drifting towards something new. As some communities became more sedentary, near especially productive environments, people began investing more labor into particular locations. They built structures. They processed food in repeated places. They returned to the same settlements. They stored things. That final development matters enormously. A meal disappears when you eat it. A storage pit full of grain can sit there for months. Now there is something another person could take tomorrow. More importantly, there is something you might reasonably say they should not take. Anthropologists sometimes distinguish between immediate return economies, where labor produces benefits quickly, and delayed return systems, where people invest effort now for rewards much later. Once you spend weeks clearing vegetation, maintaining a plot, repairing a structure, or filling a storage facility, your relationship with that resource changes psychologically and socially. You remember the work. You expect the reward. And if somebody else walks in and takes it, sharing suddenly feels less like generosity and more like robbery. That shift did not create modern property law, but it created the emotional and practical machinery property law would eventually formalize. Because before humans could invent ownership, they had to invent something much more dangerous: investment. Private property probably did not begin with someone drawing a line in the dirt. It probably began with someone getting annoyed. Picture the basic problem. You spend days gathering seeds, drying them, processing them, hauling them back to camp, and storing them somewhere safe. Then another person shows up, sees your carefully accumulated food supply, and treats it like a prehistoric convenience store. No checkout required. At that moment, two very old human instincts collide. One says, "We survive by sharing." The other says, "I worked for that." That tension becomes much stronger once humans start creating what anthropologists sometimes call delayed return resources. Things that require effort now but produce benefits later. A wild berry patch does not care who found it first. A maintained plot does. A temporary shelter may be abandoned after a few nights. A house repaired over years becomes something closer to a household asset. And stored food is perhaps the most obvious turning point of all, because storage transforms food from an immediate event into a controllable future resource. Once calories can sit behind a wall, inside a pit, or inside a container, access becomes negotiable. Who is allowed in? Who contributed? Who gets how much? Who decides? Those are not just food questions anymore. They are property questions. Sedentism made the problem even more intense. When people move frequently, accumulating too many possessions is inconvenient because everything eventually has to be carried. Mobility puts a natural tax on ownership. You can own 20 beautiful stone bowls. You can also carry 20 beautiful stone bowls. Congratulations on your new back injury. But once people remain in one place longer, possessions stop being such a burden. Heavy tools, storage vessels, grinding stones, building materials, and household goods can accumulate because nobody has to pack the entire living room every few weeks. Then there is land. Land itself is difficult to own in any meaningful way if your group constantly moves across huge territories and if useful resources appear unpredictably. But once people repeatedly clear, sow, weed, irrigate, fence, or otherwise improve a particular area, the land becomes associated with labor. And humans are extremely sensitive to labor. We may argue endlessly about fairness, but even small children understand the basic emotional logic of, I made this. That does not mean early cultivators instantly invented modern private farms with surveyed boundaries and legal titles. Rights could belong to households, kin groups, lineages, villages, or entire communities. Different people could also hold different rights over the same resource. One group might use the land. Another might inherit it. Another might control access to water. Prehistoric property could be messy. Modern property is also messy. We just added paperwork. What matters is that storage, long-term residence, and investment created situations where exclusive claims became increasingly useful. And useful social rules have a habit of becoming traditions. Traditions have a habit of becoming institutions. But archaeology has a problem here. Ownership is invisible. A pot survives. A wall survives. A storage room survives. The sentence "do not touch my grain" does not. So if we want to know when property became real, we have to look for the fingerprints of an idea that left no bones behind. The earliest evidence for property is frustrating, because archaeologists cannot excavate the sentence, "Hey, that's mine." They have to excavate behavior. And one of the most useful places to look is inside early farming villages of Southwest Asia, where people began building permanent houses, storing food, managing crops, and dividing space in increasingly deliberate ways. Storage is especially revealing. When archaeologists find grain packed into controlled rooms, bins, or containers associated with particular households, that suggests more than simple abundance. It suggests that access mattered. Food was not necessarily sitting in one giant communal pile where anyone could casually help themselves. Somebody was deciding who got in. That does not automatically prove modern private property. A storage room might belong to a household, an extended family, a lineage, or an entire community. Archaeology usually cannot tell us whether prehistoric people would have recognized anything resembling a modern legal title, but it can show us increasing control. At sites such as Tel Sabi in what is now Syria, archaeologists discovered clay sealings used to secure containers, doors, or storage spaces during the Neolithic. These small lumps of clay could be impressed with seals, creating a simple way to monitor whether something had been opened. Basically, prehistoric tamper-evident packaging. Except instead of returning your suspiciously opened cereal box to customer service, you probably had a much more personal conversation. Sealing technology matters because it suggests people were not merely storing goods. They were regulating access to them. Other archaeological clues come from the landscape itself. Neolithic farmers increasingly invested labor in particular plots through cultivation, manuring, clearing, and repeated use. Archaeologists can sometimes detect long-term soil enrichment around ancient settlements, suggesting that certain fields were being maintained repeatedly rather than used randomly and abandoned. That kind of investment creates memory. This is the field we improved. This is the plot we planted. This is the harvest we expect. And once a community starts associating particular people with particular houses, storage spaces, tools, animals, or cultivated areas, property rights can exist even without contracts, courts, or fences. The enforcement mechanism might simply be reputation, or kinship, or 30 relatives who all agree that you should put the grain back. Burials add another intriguing dimension. In some prehistoric communities, houses were rebuilt repeatedly in the same locations, and ancestors were buried beneath or near domestic structures. That may have strengthened long-term relationships between families and particular places. A house was no longer just shelter. It could become history. And history is one of the easiest ways to turn possession into entitlement. Still, we should be careful. A locked granary does not tell us exactly who owned the grain. A boundary does not tell us whether ownership was individual or communal. The archaeological record gives us footprints, not contracts. But by the Neolithic, those footprints are getting difficult to ignore. Humans were no longer merely using resources, they were increasingly controlling access to them. And that is where possession begins to look a lot like property. Here is where the neat story starts causing problems. The simple version says humans discovered farming, farming created surplus, surplus created wealth, and wealth created private property. Very tidy, possibly too tidy. Because farming itself requires a strange amount of trust in the future. You plant seeds now, protect them for months, and expect to eat the result later. That only makes sense if you believe you will still have some recognized claim to the harvest when it finally appears. Otherwise, agriculture becomes an extremely generous hobby. You do all the work. Everyone else attends harvest. Researchers Samuel Bowles and Jung Kyu Choi have argued that farming and possession-based property rights may have co-evolved rather than appearing in a simple one-way sequence. Their models suggest that cultivation could become more attractive when people were able to defend the products of their labor, while farming itself created resources that were much easier to claim and defend than many wild foods. That creates a feedback loop. More investment makes ownership more useful. More secure ownership makes investment more worthwhile. And suddenly the chicken and egg problem has acquired a fence. But this is a hypothesis supported by models and comparative reasoning, not a videotape from 10,000 years ago. We still do not know exactly how the earliest property systems worked. Some land may have been controlled by entire communities. Some resources may have belonged to households. Rights could change by season. Access might depend on kinship, marriage, residence, status, or custom. And importantly, sharing did not disappear just because farming appeared. People could defend one resource fiercely and share another generously. Humans are very talented at maintaining contradictory rules. We can say, "What's mine is mine," and 5 minutes later lend someone a ladder. There is also debate over how much inequality followed immediately from these changes. Farming made durable wealth easier to accumulate in many places because fields, houses, livestock, and stored food could persist over time. But agriculture did not instantly produce landlords, peasants, and a prehistoric homeowners association. That took different forms in different societies. Environment mattered. Population density mattered. Inheritance rules mattered. Political power mattered. And archaeology keeps reminding us that there was no single universal road from foraging to property. Some hunter-gatherers developed strong territorial rights. Some farmers maintained substantial communal ownership. Some societies accumulated remarkable wealth without turning every valuable resource into individually owned property. So asking, when was private property invented, may be slightly misleading. There may never have been a single invention. Instead, humans probably assembled property from older behaviors: possession, territoriality, reciprocity, inheritance, exclusion, and the expectation that effort should produce some future claim. Eventually, those ingredients became stable enough that communities could treat ownership as a social fact. And once everyone agrees that a claim is real, something strange happens. The invisible rule starts behaving like a physical object. Once property becomes socially recognized, it stops being just a practical rule about who gets the grain. It starts reorganizing society, because the moment a household can reliably control land, livestock, stored food, tools, or a house, another question appears. What happens when the owner dies? That question is enormous. A temporary possession disappears with the person using it. An inheritable possession survives them. Now wealth can move through generations. A field cultivated by one family can become associated with their children. A herd can be divided among heirs. A house can become more than architecture. It can become a material link between ancestors, descendants, and social identity. Property acquires a memory, and memory creates hierarchy surprisingly efficiently. If one household begins a generation with more animals, better land, larger storage capacity, or stronger political connections, its children may begin life with advantages that another family has to build from scratch. Do that repeatedly, and inequality no longer needs to reset every generation. It can compound. Ancient societies developed many different ways of managing this problem. Some emphasized household ownership. Others preserved communal rights over fields, pastures, forests, water, or hunting grounds. In many places, ownership was not one simple legal switch between mine and not mine. It was a bundle of rights. You might have the right to farm a plot, but not sell it. Your relatives might inherit it. Neighbors might have seasonal grazing rights. A community might control the water flowing through it, which sounds confusing until you remember that modern property law also requires thousands of pages to explain who can put a fence where. Eventually, larger settlements made these relationships harder to manage through memory alone. When everybody knows everybody, disputes can be settled through reputation, kinship, negotiation, or the highly sophisticated legal institution known as gossip. But cities are different. Once hundreds or thousands of people are storing goods, exchanging animals, lending grain, transferring fields, and owing debts, society needs better memory. So administrators appear. Measurements become standardized. Seals identify people or institutions. Tokens, tablets, contracts, and later written records help track transactions, obligations, boundaries, and transfers. Property becomes bureaucratic. And bureaucracy, despite its reputation for making everything less exciting, is one of civilization's most powerful technologies. A written record allows a claim to survive distance. A legal rule allows strangers to recognize ownership. A court or ruler can enforce a claim even when your cousins are unavailable to look threatening. This changes economic life dramatically. Land can be inherited more reliably. Goods can be pledged. Debts can be recorded. Taxes can be assessed. Property can become political power. But there is a darker side. The same system that protects someone from having their harvest stolen can also allow another person to accumulate enormous amounts of land. The same rules that make investment safer can make inequality more durable. The same inheritance system that preserves a family farm can preserve a family fortune. Private property was useful because it helped humans coordinate claims over valuable resources. Then humans did what humans always do with useful inventions. We built an entire civilization on top of it, and added paperwork. Today, private property feels so normal that we barely notice how strange it is. You can own a house while standing hundreds of miles away from it. You can own shares in a company you have never visited. You can own a password-protected digital file that weighs nothing, occupies no physical territory, and can be copied in seconds. The invisible fence has become extremely sophisticated, but its foundations are still prehistoric. Property works because other people recognize your claim. The deed matters because institutions recognize it. The password matters because a system recognizes it. The fence matters because your neighbors agree, or are legally required to agree, that the space on one side belongs to you. Remove that shared recognition, and ownership becomes much harder to distinguish from simply standing near something and yelling. That is why private property is not merely about objects. It is about relationships between people concerning objects. And those relationships probably emerged slowly as our ancestors settled down, stored food, invested labor, built houses, inherited resources, defended access, and created rules that allowed communities to remember who could use what. There was no prehistoric patent office where someone officially registered the invention of mine. There were just thousands of tiny negotiations. Who gets this grain? Who sleeps in this house? Who works this field? Who inherits it? Who is allowed through that door? Over generations, the answers hardened into customs. Customs became institutions. Institutions became laws. And eventually, something as abstract as ownership became powerful enough to organize cities, economies, states, and much of modern life. Which brings us back to that ancient patch of dirt. The remarkable moment was not when one person pointed at it and said, "That's mine." Humans had probably been making claims like that for a very long time. The remarkable moment was when everybody else looked at the same dirt and said, "Fine,